everyone, I'm Grant and welcome back to the channel. I am finally driving my Wrangler again after pretty much a month of non-stop troubleshooting a vast array of problems. And I'm going to try to go over them in chronological order. Now, after I got the heat working and the hardtop reinstalled with Jacob's help, I went to drive it after Jacob had left that night, and I started running into major issues with my transmission. It would not go into first gear, and I was getting solenoid errors through CompuShift, which I really appreciated because CompuShift gave me human readable errors, which was fantastic. Well, started digging into that, and that ended up sending me down the rabbit hole of a slew of ground issues that I had created for myself over the last 3 years. I had a ground issue where I thought I had grounded the battery to my frame. I hadn't. This is my ground. You can see 2 thick cables coming out here. If you follow one of them, it goes there to my engine block. The other one, and you can't really see it, but it goes to the top, and let me see if I can adjust the camera. It goes to the top of the motor mount here. And that's where the problem is. I thought my gauges and everything inside my Wrangler were grounded to the tub. They weren't. And some of my grounds were being ground to the mounting stubs for the HVAC fan. All right, everyone, as you can tell, it's laid out. Actually putting diesel fuel in it because I don't remember the last time I put fuel in. It's been like 15 months. Discovered a couple of things. Definitely had a ground issue, so that seems to have fixed it. But when I turn on the blower motor, I'm still having issues with both my EGT and the shift solenoids. If I don't turn on the blower motor, it runs great. So I've got something going on. I got to figure it out. So when I turned on the fan, it started sending signal and noise through my entire ground loop. Let me roll up the window so it's a little bit quieter. And that ended up being really difficult to figure out. That was one of the most frustrating things I've had to figure out on this swap. That was the first of many problems. Now, the second problem I went to solve was I had 2 separate leaks from my AW4 automatic. I had one from where the TV cable used to go into the case. I had tried making just a butt cover and that just didn't work at all. But the other one was from the rear main seal. Now, that ended up being interesting to solve. And what I discovered was when I took off the Rubicon transfer case, the MVG 241OR transfer case, because I had put a clocking ring on it, the input shaft of the transfer case wasn't long enough to make contact with the seal in the back of my AW4 automatic. So that sent me down a rabbit hole of trying to figure out how to fix it, which basically included me removing the clocking ring. And I actually thought the clocking ring initially was so I could rotate the transfer case up so I'd have a flat belly. Turns out, fun fact, the clocking ring was so I could rotate the transfer case down so I'd have clearance to my tub. So I actually tried installing, with new hardware that I got from a good friend's hardware store, the transfer case without a clocking ring. And I ran into a wonderful situation where the edge of the transfer case was hitting the tub of my Wrangler. So I did what many many a hot rodder has done over the past several decades. I took a sledgehammer to the tub and I made room. Now, where it gets interesting is, after I got that done, I then went to make a better cover for the hole in the case of the automatic transmission where the TV cable used to go. And at first, I tried putting in these rubber stoppers. And I was rushing and I was tired and I had things to do the next day, so I was trying to get my Wrangler back on the road. And I dropped one of the rubber stoppers into the case of my transmission. Well, I just did something colossally stupid that's going to add like hours onto what I was trying to do tonight, and I can't do it. So, I showed earlier that I had two of these stoppers. I had a small one and a big one. Put my pinky here. I thought the other one was small enough, and I went to put it in and it went pludunk. So, I now get to drain the pan and pull this stupid thing off, which means I have to probably get a new gasket because I put the right stuff on this because, you know, of course I did. Which means this gasket is going to get torn up. I kind of just can't believe my luck. So I knew I shouldn't have done it. And I did it anyway. And you know what? I'm not doing it tonight. Now, this ended up being a blessing in disguise, truthfully. And what I mean by that is, when I took the transmission pan off, I was really bewildered to find one of the valve body bolts in the bottom of the transmission pan. It's kind of a good thing that I had to take this off. This bolt was loose. Actually, this bolt wasn't even in there. No, sorry, this bolt here. But when I ran around to check, every single one of these bolts was loose. So I ended up removing all the bolts, clearing out the holes. I ended up putting Loctite on each bolt, blue Loctite, the removable kind, not red Loctite, and retorquing everything to spec again. Now, thankfully, once I reinstalled all the bolts for the valve body with blue Loctite, torqued them to the correct specs, reinstalled the pan, clearanced the tub for the transfer case, I then went on to figuring out how to seal up the hole where the TV cable came through. And that ended up being rather simple. I just cut up the TV cable and put a little rubber stopper on the piece that protruded out of the case and put a hose clamp on it. And guess what? That solved that issue. Now, after doing all that, I started driving it again, and I started having my power steering whining again. And I tried so many things. I tried a smaller pulley. And in the end, I realized, wait a second. I'm running a TDI engine. TDI engine has a vacuum pump on the backside of the head. I ran the Hydro Boost system when I was running the Kubota engine because the Kubota doesn't produce vacuum. So what I ended up doing was reinstalling the vacuum brake booster and going back to a Volkswagen power steering pump. And I removed the Hydro Boost system completely out of the loop. And guess what? My steering works great. My brakes work like they did before. They're not as touchy. You definitely have to press the brake pedal more than I did with the Hydro Boost. but I also never think I got the Hydro Boost working correctly with the TDI. But again, I also didn't need it with the TDI either. So there's that. So after validating that the power steering was working and the brake booster was doing what I wanted it to do, I then went to solve my next problem, which was my front drive shaft under hard acceleration was slapping the tub of my Wrangler. But that spot right there is where under heavy acceleration, this is slapping the body. And the mount I have on the transmission actually does have a little bit of adjustment. And what I realized when I went to adjust it, I could shove the whole transmission to the right, which is interesting because it kind of means I might not have needed to take the sledgehammer to the tub to make clearance, but I have even more room now. So I shoved the whole transmission and transfer case to the right. And after doing that, I started the engine and I noticed it was really loud. And what I realized is by shoving the whole drivetrain to my driver's side, I was putting my hydraulic motor mounts in a bind. So what I then did was I spent time and I undid the bolts on my driver's side motor mount, the one on, if you're standing in front of my Wrangler on the left side of the motor, I took that motor mount plate off between the engine and the top of the motor mount. This is where the engine's now kind of resting where it seems happy. And I think the other motor mount is now in a neutral position. And you can see just how much off I am everywhere. So not really sure how I'm gonna fix this yet. And when it popped off, there was no chance of me getting that plate back on. So I spent a whole Saturday re-drilling that hole with my drill press and welding up the plate and reinforcing the plate. So now my engine, transmission, and transfer case are in a neutral position, and that made everything so much quieter. And I've been really happy with it. Once I got all of that figured out, then I went down the most annoying path of trying to figure out the cooling system on my TJ Wrangler. So I started sending the temperatures that I was running to both my engine tuner and my contact at HGM Electronics, and it turns out I was now overcooling my entire system. My engine wasn't getting to the right operational range, and my transmission, because I was running the Ford 6R80 cooler, was never getting over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, ever. So the first thing I did was replace the Ford 6R80 cooler by just completely taking it out of the loop, and I went back to the factory transmission cooler that came on this TJ Wrangler, and that solved the transmission cooling. And it solved it so much so that I am convinced AW4s run hot because of that TV cable. With the CompuShift controlling line pressure, and it bases line pressure on load and boost and everything, not just throttle position, my transmission has stayed way cooler. And I realize it's winter time, but we've had a couple of days where it was 65, 70, and the hottest I've seen the transmission is about 185 degrees. And on those days, I'm hammering on it. I'm not being gentle at all. But once I got that solved, then I went down the rabbit hole of the cooling system on a TDI. And that has been the most complex 3 weeks of my life ever. And I'm actually going to cut to a clip now where I explain it on my whiteboard on how I had to solve it. Before we get started on this, I'm going to start off by saying I have no artistic talent whatsoever, and that should be obvious here. But this is a rough representation of my engine in my engine bay. So I have my TDI engine. That is supposed to be the turbo. I know, it looks great. This is my thermostat housing. This is the coolant pipe that wraps around the bottom of the TDI. This is the coolant flange on the back of the head of the motor below where my vacuum pump is. This is my heater core. This is the expansion tank, and that is my radiator. Now, what I'm going to do is show you the base loop that I have to have, which I don't have right now, to make this work correctly. And it's this. I need a hose going from the end of my coolant pipe to the bottom of the coolant flange. The other thing I need is a small hose going from the outlet of the cap of my radiator, because I have a 0 PSI cap. And that's gonna go into my expansion tank. I also have a tube going from my expansion tank, which is much bigger. I believe it's a 1/2 inch. And that feeds into this pipe here. So, and that's the flow. We are gonna call this the hot loop, because I basically had to think of my cooling system as 2 different loops. So I'm actually gonna put hot loop here, that's in red. Now, the other part that I have in all of this is the output from the other side of the cooling flange going into my heater core. This is how you get heat inside a vehicle. This will also output back into that water pipe as well. Now, it's actually going to go into the oil cooler, and then the output of the oil cooler will go into this pipe, but for this purpose, that is all that matters. This is the hot loop that I have to have. Now, one of the things that took me a while to wrap my head around all this is the main outlet for the radiator. Now, technically, this is in blue, but this is part of the cold loop, and this took me a while to really wrap my head around. The water pump is always going to be pushing fluid into this hose going to the radiator. But because I have a 0 PSI cap at the top of my radiator, I'm also putting fluid into this expansion tank and then keeping the coolant level filled by going into this water pipe here. The key to all of this is that this hot loop stays together. And the way the thermostat opens on these TDIs is when coolant gets pushed in from the bottom of the coolant flange here, which I can actually get. This is the piece I'm trying to replicate. I'm connecting a hose from this output on the bottom here, which my current cooling flange does not have. That's part of the problem I'm running into with all this. This will hook directly into this water pipe. This will loop around to my heater core. This is what's going to my radiator. However, this is kind of a separate loop, except for the fact that it fills my expansion tank here. By doing this, I'm always pushing hot water against the thermostat, so once it reaches a certain temperature, that thermostat will open. Let me go put this away. Once that thermostat opens, we take cold coolant and supply it on the other side of the thermostat. Cold coolant goes in, goes through the engine block, and goes through all of this hot section. And that's how it has to work. Now, the part I have not talked about yet is the turbo over here, because my turbo is water cooled. Now, the way I do it, and we're just going to do this kind of lazy and go, we're going to have a Y join here, and we're going to say this is connection 1, and we're going to have a connection 1 over here. That goes into the turbo. So I am supplying cold coolant from the radiator into the turbo, and it's getting its pressure from this cycle here because it's always going to be pushing water. The mistake I was making, and this ended up being a huge mistake, was I was returning that coolant right there. And what I effectively was doing, because I thought, wait a second, the turbo has a lot of heat. I'm always going to be heating up the water. That's not going to be a problem. But what I realized was when I'm not under a heavy load or full boost or a lot of throttle, I'm actually cooling off the water going into my heater core, which is going back into this pipe, which means this thermostat is never opening. But my temperature sensor, which is on this output, was getting hotter and hotter and hotter, but the thermostat was never opening. That was my problem. So what we need to do, instead of having the turbo return to the heater core, we need it to return to this pipe going to the radiator. That is not going to cool off this amount of coolant to the point where this thermostat won't open. It will cool it off slightly, but the volume of coolant going in here is much greater than the volume of coolant going into my heater core. And there were other issues as well, actually. There's a steam port, which I hooked up incorrectly. I actually have my steam port going to my expansion tank. That was a big mistake. The steam port needs to be going into the return line for my radiator as well. And I realize this is all a bit convoluted, but it's taken me over a week of trying different hosing combinations. I mean, to give you an example, some of the things I have tried on camera, I've gotten these Y joints where I teed together the expansion tank and the heater core. I got a different coolant flange where it had two of these, which I ended up never hooking this up. But I have tried so many flows of this. I've tried different thermostats. I've tried thermostats where I've drilled holes in them. And that will actually keep it cool, but it keeps it too cool. It keeps it like 150 degrees. And the reason for that is you're constantly feeding cold water into the engine so it can never get up to temperature. But I think this is the loop that will solve my heating and cooling problems. In the middle of redoing the cooling system and going to that different housing, I discovered something I messed up so bad when I assembled this months ago and I never checked. I crushed the cooling temperature sensor wiring harness between my transmission and my adapter plate. So that means my engine has been, I believe it defaults to hot, and it's just been running a hot tune this entire time. Now, have I ever checked for engine check lights or error codes or anything? No. No, I have not. Now, as part of doing all this cooling, I replaced the coolant flange on the back of the motor. I replaced the expansion tank I was running because I actually found one that was better suited for my application, and it kind of solves a battery problem I was running into. Though I didn't put the right spacers on it, so I got to work on it again, but I can fix that easily enough. What else did I replace? Oh, I also had to modify the coolant pipe that wraps around the engine again. So it's been a lot of work to just get this back to the point where it's up and running. The interesting thing is this is really my first drive with the cooling system set up the way that I think it needs to be set up, though I am going to replace the thermostat. But it's the first time I've driven it without the coolant temperature sensor wiring harness smashed between the adapter and the engine, and it made everything so much quieter. I had a lot of these weird vibrations that I couldn't figure out. And they would come and go, and they were inconsistent. That was the thing. Sometimes it would happen, sometimes it wouldn't. At first I thought it was my pinion angles. I checked that. They were within 1/10 of a degree, which from everything I've read, is good enough. And I really couldn't figure out where these vibrations were coming from. It was because I had a bind between my transmission and engine. But yeah, so that's kind of what I've been doing over the last pretty much 3 weeks of my life, has been just troubleshooting so many small issues that admittedly I created for myself. But as of right now, minus needing a different thermostat, everything seems to be happy. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for all the support. This is going to be the last video that I post this year, and I will see you sometime soon. Goodbye. Boost! That never gets old.